Warning, strong content. This episode of Murder Trails includes references to true crime, murder and homicide, and to people who are now deceased. For more information, please read our description. Welcome to Murder Trails, presented by Jack Sim and Crime Tours Australia. Hello everyone, Jack Sim here from Crime Tours Australia, Brisbane Crime Tours, author and publisher of the Murder Trails series, and welcome back to our podcast, Murder Trails, episode 2 of our brand new series. And joining me today is my friend and colleague, Councillor Paul Tully.
Hi, Jack.
Hello, Paul. Thanks for coming back for our next episode. Yeah. Our episode today is called The Whiskey A Go-Go. And Caleb, our producer here today, we was chatting with him off air, off camera, off air, about how he's only a young man. He didn't know about the Whiskey A Go-Go. It's incredible to me, having grown up with that being talked about so intensely amongst adults, teenagers, children. It was sort of, the name was a household name because of what had happened. Yeah. I think a lot of people not only don't know that this terrible crime took place in our city, but they don't necessarily know the location. And incredibly, through my books and our tours, a lot of research is put in, and sometimes the crime scenes are long gone. Quite often they're long gone. You can walk people to or guide people through words to the locations of an old crime, where it took place, an actual murder spot or crime scene. But they're long gone. But in the case of the Whiskey A Go-Go, incredibly, despite it being such a tragic event, the building survives. It was on the corner of, it still is physically in structure, still there on the corner of St Paul's Terrace and Amelia Street, Fortitude Valley.
Yeah, just from that valley, the Five Ways, I think they call it, there, and just diagonally across from where the Shamrock Hotel used to be. But that's true. The names of these crimes and where they were and the circumstances disappear. It's like politics. After you've gone 5 or 10 years, no one remembers you. So it's the same with crimes and crime scenes. There's no doubt about that.
It's fascinating to me. We one of our crime tours we run is the Bloody Brisbane Coach Tour and the Moonlight State Fortitude Valley True Crime Tour, where we walk the streets of the valley and talk about this era of corruption and grubbery, and with legal casinos and brothels being the norm. And we walk to the Whiskey A Go-Go crime scene, and our guides we share tablets with photos of what it looked like then. And incredibly, that the building physically looks almost identical as it did in the day. And it's extraordinary to show people a photo of what the club looked like, then show what it looked like after the fire. And
it's almost identical, Jack. Like when you come down St Paul's Terrace, you're heading towards the exhibition grounds and towards Bowen Hills. The structure of the building, as you say, is almost identical. And it's quite unusual for that to be the situation.
Quite often with terrible crimes around the world, not just in Australia, but around the world, when a building is the scene of a terrible crime, they're razed, they're completely demolished. People deliberately move on, they knock down houses and things. In this case, it survived, which I find incredible. Paul, I've long been an advocate. I think that building should be some sort of a memorial, the whole building, top and bottom. I wouldn't want it to be a tourist attraction, but it is something that's so special in the story of our city that I think it should be. The stories of those that perish could be told within its structure, and the whole story of this, to me, it should be a landmark that is potent in our city, that people for all time remember this very bad period of time. I mean, This year is 50 years, half a century, and it's still not resolved.
Yeah, and 15 people died there. It's very difficult now. So it's privately owned. It's that decision wasn't made at the time, and it could have been, but it wasn't. I think what you're saying, a lot of people would endorse that.
I think it's just important. But look, today we're going to be talking about what actually happened. For those listening that don't know, the Whiskey A Go-Go was a popular nightclub at the top end of the valley. It had enjoyed a wonderful reputation. Lots of different age groups would go there. They had a a dance floor. They had a band sort of area where the bands could set up and play. But they also had tables, chairs, a restaurant with a fully qualified chef. Today, when you think of nightclubs in the valley, most people, younger people particularly, just think, oh, it's a place you go and you get dressed up and you go in and get drunk and might have a pretty architecture.
There was a bit of that.
Yeah, it was a bit of that, yeah. But the whiskey was a bit more broad, wasn't it? In its
it was. It took a lot
Did
of
you
people.
know there, Paul?
Yeah, I think I might have only been there once, maybe twice, but the youngest person who died there was 17. I think the oldest was 50, one of the victims from Rockhampton. So it was a wide group of people, but one of them was from Ipswich. He was 32. And it attracted a lot of people. It had a name, Whiskey A Go-Go. Like, that's one of the rare names that people of that era couldn't possibly forget. And everyone knew where that was.
Well, there was a landmark establishment in Los Angeles called the Whiskey A Go-Go. And, listeners, viewers, this is the era of go-go dancers and, great music and, good entertainment. As we painted in our earlier episode, cabaret clubs, nightclubs. This was a place where Brisbaneites let their hair down, and the whiskey was no exception. But there was a bit of trouble brewing at this time, as we heard previously. I just thought I might run through some of the people who were there that night. There was Carol Green Paul. She was a 26-year-old secretary from Camp Hill on Brisbane's south side. She was there to enjoy the live music. Her mum was quite concerned about her going along because she'd been following the news, clubs being, the Torinos being bombed.
Yes.
She was a bit worried about her daughter going. But she wanted to go because she wanted to see one of her favourite bands playing that night with a female cousin. They got dressed up and they went along to see the Deltones.
The Deltones. Even I'd well forgotten that name too.
The legendary Deltones with Pee Wee with his big, loud, his beautiful baritone voice.
Yes.
They were playing at the National Hotel, again, a place well known in Brisbane circles at that time. But they were late and they missed the set there, so they decided to catch them at the Whiskey A Go-Go. So they headed along there. There was already quite a big crowd there to see the Deltones. Among them was William Nolan, Wendy Drew and Brian Watson, Leslie Pallethorpe and David Green. Father and son Ernie and Des Peters were there too to see the band and celebrate the purchase of their first racehorse at an auction at the RNA Showgrounds. A pretty 17-year-old waitress, Jennifer Davies, who'd only been in Brisbane 3 months, she brought them their drinks. Jennifer had moved up from Melbourne and was living at New Farm, and she'd only been working at the Whiskey A Go-Go. She was working there 3 nights. She'd only been working there a short time, but she worked 3 nights a week there and in another restaurant in Brisbane during the day. Also at the club that night were 29-year-old Decima Carroll and 23-year-old barman Peter Marcus. In the kitchen, sampling the cuisine, was fellow Cordon Bleu chef Paul Zola from the National Hotel. As the Deltones took the stage, it was everyone there clapped and cheered. They were really excited. The guys put on a great set. The atmosphere was electric. Everyone was having fun. Most people wanted to stay on until the early hours of the morning. They were all friends, family members, work colleagues, musicians, their fans, completely unaware of the danger that they were actually in.
I think most of them wouldn't have realised or connected, the earlier warnings that there was a pretty reputable, sort of club where people went, on a Thursday night, the early hours. I think most of them wouldn't have even given it a second thought.
I've interviewed quite a few people, Paul, who were there that night and then left early and through strange circumstances decided to leave early, and they would have been there normally and stayed on to watch the Deltones and Trinity, who were to play after the Deltones. They were the house band. They were due to, I think, play the following Monday, but had been brought on to play that night. But there were lots of people who were there right up almost until the firebombing moment, the terrible moment. But they left for whatever reason. That day something had changed, so they had to go and catch someone else before another club closed. Or it's extraordinary the number of people that were just that could have almost died in what was about to happen. Those people I've talked to described that everyone I spoke to was well aware of the problems that the whiskey was going through. The owners were well-known men. I believe they lived on the north side, the Little Brothers. Everyone knew, lots of people knew them. People wanted to support this club through the problems they were having financially too. And in fact, I can tell you, two of the people I spoke to who were there that night have told me that they were aware of the financial issues and they wanted to support, they wanted the club to stay open. They loved the place. And despite what they read in the papers, they were really passionate about supporting this venue, which they adored.
I've got to say that the prelude to that, which we spoke about in the previous program episode, there was a feeling that something could happen, but no one thought it could be as bad as this.
No.
Yeah, a fire, the petrol being ignited on the steps in the tins there, and then just funneling up into the top story. It was extraordinary. People were basically trapped and died, and 15 of them. Terrible, terrible, terrible situation.
Well, Trinity started to, they were originally built, Trinity, who were the house band, they were originally booked to play on the following Monday, but in a twist of fate, the group that was playing on the night following the Deltones cancelled. And so those guys from the band turned up to play at the Whiskey A Go-Go a full week earlier. This terrible twist of fate meant that two of the band members, Colin Folster and Darcy Day, were doomed. 19-year-old Faye Will, who worked for Queensland Railways refreshment rooms, she also was about to die. She turned up to watch Trinity with her brother. And at very tragically, at 2:05 a.m, just minutes before tragedy, Faye's brother decided to go home. He said goodbye to his sister. This was the last time he ever saw his sibling alive.
Yeah, and it was all over not long after that. And I think the tragedy was that it enveloped the flames and the smoke enveloped the club so quickly, and people didn't know where to go, where to turn, how to get out.
At 2:08 a.m, Constable McSherry drove past the club in his patrol car. He normally patrolled the valley at this time of night. He noticed a bloke drunk staggering beside another car, nothing unusual in the valley, and he thought, I'll drive around the block, and if he's still drunk, I'll book him. If you saw him at the wheel of the car, he'd book him, So he just circled the block, planning to return. And just as he drove away, a car pulled up out the front of the Whiskey A Go-Go, and two men wearing black clothes and balaclavas to hide their appearance emerged from the vehicle. They scanned the street, made sure no one was around, and then seeing no one, they went to the boot of the car and they removed two large petrol drums full of fuel that they'd siphoned from cars in the back street. Didn't want to spend the money on fuel, just nick it out of a car. That was pretty common in those days too. People siphoning petrol from people's cars if you're running low.
It's pretty normal.
One of these were heavy drums. They carried them over into the entrance of the club, rolled them into the foyer, and they lit a book of matches, the sort of matches you got from hotels in the old days, and threw it in. As fuel spewed from the drum, it ignited. And within just minutes, the club was enveloped in flame. My understanding, Paul, is that at the top of the staircase there was a powerful air conditioning unit, or close to the top of the stairs. This created sort of a draft that pulled the air up
straight up into the club, into the club itself.
On the first floor, or the upper floor of the building, all the windows were glass and they were closed so that the air conditioning could keep people cool. And
there were curtains that hung down from most, if not all of those as well. But can I say this, the actions that happened, this wasn't a disused or an unoccupied nightclub. It was clear, would have been clear from the people doing that. This was the signature tune of what they were trying to do. And they could hardly say it was an accident, that they thought everyone was going to get out. This was in the middle of a nightclub performance. And the two who were finally convicted, and any others who weren't convicted, who were behind this, really stand condemned for allowing 15 innocent people to die.
There's no way that this, over the years that followed, the two men who were convicted of it, from within the walls of Boggo Road Jail, Brisbane's notorious prison, maintained that they were innocent, the victims of police corruption. We wouldn't do such a thing. It beggars belief that anybody could argue that they were not aware of what would happen if you blew up 2 petrol drums in the entrance to a popular club. The club probably normally would have perhaps as double the number of people, but on this night, I think it was around 80 odd people that were there.
And most of them did, yes, and most of them did get out. But obviously, in the panic, in the seconds after the drums, fired up, it was just pandemonium. Lucky that more people didn't die.
It was my understanding, Paul, that the aircon sort of pulled those flames up the stairs, and that the rubber material on the staircase helped pull that ignited.
And there was a bend in the stairs back into the top of the nightclub, and and as I say, I would have been there maybe 6 months before that. It's not the layout of clubs is not something you take a lot of notice of, because my images of that now are the external images on the day, after daylight in the fire, when the local newspapers just turned this into one of the most graphic and hurtful stories that Brisbane's ever seen.
It was, and as I said, growing up, it was something people, palpable, the impact of the crime on the era. Everybody sort of knew someone who'd been there that night who either died or almost died. I've interviewed a person who was born in the back of a taxi cab because when the fire and the need to get victims to hospital, there were no ambulances available. So
that'd be right.
He was born in the back of a taxi because they couldn't get, his mum and dad couldn't get an ambulance when she went into labour. His mum went into labour. And he said, I was born in a cab because of the Whiskey A Go-Go. When Sherry come back round the corner, just a few minutes later, and the whole club was on fire, with the glass windows on that first floor had flames pouring out of them. There's a graphic photo that those who are watching this on YouTube will be able to see, taken, I think it was from the Courier Mail newspaper, the only real shot of the club on fire. But you can see these flames pouring out of the windows. It's truly just otherworldly, like hell. And he contacted fire brigade. The fire brigade trucks arrived and began trying to extinguish the flames. It was just under about 20 minutes. I think they managed to suppress the flames. One of the cooks at the club was a bit of a hero, because he managed to get people through the darkness. I might just explain, as the flames went up into the club, the curtains that you mentioned, Paul, they caught on fire because they were made of a plastic material that just sort of ignited and melted and dripped. And that spread up into as I understand it, the foam ceiling panels that they had in the roof. And that then the flames then cut the power.
Yes.
And the air conditioner was pulling all this black toxic smoke from these materials on fire into the club. So people were plunged into darkness. They couldn't see. There were no emergency lights or anything. The chef of the club helped to get people down the stairs and out through the back door. Back doors. Those doors are no longer those of the time, but the entrance or the exit they managed to get out is still in the location where they poured out into safety. But McSherry and the fire brigade, they were really hopeful that when they went into the club that they would find more people alive. But unfortunately, 15 people had perished, and there were that's often reported even to this day in articles. 15 people died, but there were literally scores of other people who were seriously injured. I interviewed a person quite some years ago, and he'd very badly broken his arm. He'd thrown himself out through one of the windows, broke it with a chair. And he climbed out onto an awning, and then he dropped to the ground. And as he fell, it was quite a long way down. And as he landed on the footpath, he went sideways, and he smashed his vice in his upper arm, broke his arm, and he had a plate in it ever since, and never had proper use of his arm again. There were other people who did the same, that were lacerated by glass. And the psychological impact, not just on those that were in the club who survived, but on their families who lost their friends, on the police and the fire crews that had to attend and then remove all those poor people who died. I mean, the medical people that had to treat people with these injuries. The impact on our city is just profound.
Yeah, it's memories that will never fade for the people closely involved, but people who were living in Brisbane at the time, or living in Queensland and around Australia, we'll never forget how bad it really was. It was all over in one sense, even though the fire took longer to extinguish, but it was all over for some people's lives in 2 or 3 minutes. I was going to say there was no way out. There was for some people, but in the smoke and the confusion, the yelling, the angst that people had, they didn't have time to think. They didn't know, as you say, the electricity had completely gone. It was a darkened sort of club without the electricity. People didn't have a clue how to get out, and they perished in a matter of minutes.
Discover Brisbane's criminal history. Join me, Jack Sim, and my team of guides as we explore Queensland's fascinating criminal past. Cases we explore include the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Betty Shanks murder, and the Vampire Killer. We have a range of different crime walks and coach tours. To book a tour, brisbanecrimetours.com.au or crimetoursaustralia.com.au. Look forward to sharing our dark past with you. Things like we see today, like fire evacuation plans, the written up plans are on walls and such. This sort of thing was not really very rigidly enforced. There was a fire brigade did play a role in trying to bring buildings up to code, particularly old buildings, but this was a little bit slacker in those days than it is today. And
but even to this day, can I say, I go into places like restaurants or bigger places, I still look around for the exit doors, even in cinemas and places like that. That goes back 50 years, and people might say, you must be happy with the signage. Who knows? Even the emergency lighting might fail to work. You sit in the cinema and you've got a couple hundred people in that today. Would they know where to go and how to get out in the event of a fire?
Yeah, fire. That's right. I mean, this was a much more simple and naive time too, and perhaps people didn't really think of these things at the time, but who would have ever thought that something like this would happen? Just was such a shocking thing. One of the urban myths is that the perpetrators blocked the exit doors with drums of spoiled or old oil
and fat. Yes.
That's one or another version I've heard is that the perpetrators blocked or locked the doors from the outside so people couldn't get out, and that's not true. What is true is that there were 2 drums of spent kitchen oil that were in the fire exit area, and that made it very difficult for them to get out.
But I think it was accepted at the time. That was where it was pretty well normally stored, and there was nothing unusual about it. And as you say, when the 2 balaclava persons turned up, they had a quick look around. They weren't pre-planning and doing other stuff at the back or at the side. They turned up and quickly lit the fire and disappeared. Yeah.
A witness at the time who was ignored by police, whose statement was never part of the trial of the 2 men involved who were ultimately convicted. She identified there was a 3rd person sitting at the wheel of the getaway car, and that was never made prominent by the police at the time, which instantly makes a complicated scenario, not just what ultimately was established.
It mightn't have matched the police narrative of what happened, but I recall the next morning the photographs which were in the Telegraph newspaper of the old fire engines as we used to call them, and some of the media and some of the public and the police still on St Paul's Terrace looking at the burnt out shell. It's a memory in my mind. I don't really remember the club as an active working club. I do remember that shocking photograph taken probably about 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours after the bombing. That's what's in my mind, and it's still there 50 years later, even when I go. And over the years, my boys are now in their early 20s. We go to the exhibition, we'd find a park down past St Paul's Terrace, and going past that building, I'd point that out to them so that they knew part of the history of Brisbane. But that that fire scene in the newspapers is still shockingly in my mind 50 years later.
The one of the this was the era, as we were talking about in the last episode, of Joh Bjelke-Petersen, Premier of Queensland. The Premier came out at the time and said that there'd be swift justice. Just a few days later, two men whose names became not only infamous in Brisbane but Australia-wide were arrested and dragged before the court, protesting their innocence pretty much from the start. One of them, the two men involved were John Andrew Stewart, who was reported in the Telegraph as being 32 at the time of the crime, and James Richard Finch, an Englishman, a friend of John Andrew Stewart. He was reported as being 28 in the tally as well. These two fellas had a long and extensive criminal background, especially John Andrew Stewart. Stewart was a good friend of Brian Bolton, who we talked about in the last episode.
Yeah, the journalist from the Sunday Sun, yeah.
And he was one of the sources that Brian Bolton was using to reveal this situation with southern criminals muscling in on the Brisbane nightclub scene in an attempt to extort money and protection money.
And probably not necessarily realising that the criminals moving in but one of them was at least the person Brian Bolton was talking to. That they'd set the scene that, this is what we know, that, they're going to muscle in on the scene, they're going to try to extract money and extort nightclub owners and operators. But it all appeared to come true. And of course, Stewart and Finch always said that they were verbaled by the police. But as we've discussed
what does that mean?
Verbaled means, in one they said police had a prepared statement for them to sign. And of course, if they say it was given voluntarily, there were lots of cases like this where people were verbal, that it was just he said, she said, the police said that you said this, but then you refused to sign the document.
This was I remember when I was researching another very old crime from the 1930s. This was actually part of police training in Queensland back in the early days. Is you would type up for listeners and viewers wouldn't know, but this was a standard type of policing before many of the improvements that were made in our justice system. A police officer knew inverted commas, knew for sure that a fellow was guilty of burglary, for example. And so they'd bring him in, he was a known burglar, and they'd put a statement in front of him that he burgled 6 houses in Ascot on Brisbane's north side. And it'd be all typed up that on this date, at this time, I burgled these houses. A typed confession, they put it in front of him, and they would then put pressure on him to sign it, agree that he would do it. I've met many old crimps who told me that they used to sign stuff and they'd make deals with the police that they'd cop a sentence in relation to these charges so that their friend or someone else would be let go, or the police did deals with criminals. It was an actual technique, as horrid as we might find it today. Police used it, usually always in the police's favour. But Stewart and Finch talking about being verbal by the coppers, that almost from the start resonated with a hell of a lot of Brisbane residents who were already aware that police could be your worst enemy.
That's true. But as you and I have discussed in relation to other matters, you might get verbaled. That doesn't prove you didn't do the crime. Like the police probably, in a lot of cases, knew who was right for it. And even though they were verbal, and in today's sort of criminal and judicial sort of proceedings, that would be horrendous and probably see the police charged with offences. The fact that they were verbaled and statements were presented for them to sign, they didn't necessarily mean that they weren't guilty.
An old detective friend of mine who's passed away now, who learned his craft in the 30s and 40s. He's long gone now, but he lived to quite a ripe old age. He said to me, look, people today would find it unacceptable, but he said, people don't understand the type of vicious pricks we were dealing with. That's his exact words. He said, dangerous and evil men. He said, we had none of the policing techniques of today. And he said, this was a power play. When you had him sitting in a chair under questioning, he said, this was a power play between two parties, us and them. And he said, if you could screw him on if you could get him pinned down with a statement, he said, then you could, you had something over him. And he said, He said he said a lot of the crims of the era he went through. He said they couldn't read and write. He said so we had to type it up for them. Because they had to go before a court.
Yeah.
And he said I'm not making excuses. He said I know for a fact that at times this was used wrongly, but he said in my day when I was taught, this was a technique to secure and make society safer from some of the worst bastards you'd ever come across.
Well, why wouldn't you plead guilty to 10 charges to avoid another 20? Yeah, it's sort of from that era, the 30s, 40s, 50s. Yeah, it's very hard in today's, it's like political correctness. If you go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years, if things were normal, they mightn't have been right, but they were normal and they were pretty well accepted by society. And that doesn't surprise me that what the police officers in that 30s and 40s and 50s in Queensland were doing.
Look, and for listeners and viewers, don't think for one moment Paul and I are condoning these sort of acts at all, but it was a different era, and it's very important we talk and discuss some of these sort of differences. When Stuart Finch claimed, though, that police had verbaled him, it resonated with a lot of Queenslanders who'd been on the wrong side of the police. And by this time in Queensland, the police force was almost like a semi-paramilitary sort of group. They were a group, very close organisation.
Tight-knit, and very tough.
Yeah, very tough, physically tough. This was the era where the other thing that's changed, maybe it's different today, but police often used physical force to.
Do you remember the old telephone book technique?
Yeah,
those days when the telephone book was that thick. I know many cases barristers have told me over the years that they had no doubt that their clients were telling the truth. The book was placed on their stomach and they were hit, and because there were no marks that were left on that, but it made people confess to crimes which probably they did, but they wouldn't have otherwise admitted to it except for the physical punishment. Now, I'm talking about, I guess, an era in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s.
A friend of mine, Kevin Gregory Ryan, a standover man and thug of the 1940s and 50s. He's gone now. Kev was a physically big guy, worked in Brisbane and in Sydney as a standover man, that is a debt collector and so on. Knew all the characters of the day. He was a dear friend of mine. He had a phone book's worth of criminal history behind his life. But Kevin said to me, he said, we expected coppers to do this to us. And he said it was part of, when you're in the criminal circles, this is what police did. And we expected it. And he said, and if they didn't do it, he said, we would have had them for dinner. He said, it was a different time. And he didn't have much time for, he said, give me the days where a copper would just belch in the gob and then demand you signed a statement. He said, I'd rather that degree of honesty from him than, he said, someone sitting there trying to get into me head and understand me and be kind and that. He said, it's just a different time, I guess. But Stuart Finch, for all their claims of being innocent, I have no doubt in my mind, Paul, they actually were involved. I don't believe they were alone in it. But
no, that's going to be interesting with the new coronial inquest. We're still waiting for that to be handed down. Whether there were others who are in the criminal scene in Brisbane, well known in the criminal scene for various reasons, whether or not they were involved as well. Not necessarily on the night, but certainly behind this extortion. Yeah.
Well, Stuart and Finch were arrested and they were brought into the police watch house, arguing and carrying on in court. Then they ended up being brought before the Holland Park Magistrates Court for the hearing of the charges. They were charged with arson and one count of murder. They actually were charged with 15 counts of murder, but only one charge was what they were going to face in the Supreme Court. Right. It was in relation to one of those who died, Paul.
It was the 17-year-old, I believe, and it's a technique which has been used quite properly, that if for some reason that charge failed, they could charge them. Well, you can't be. Well, the law has been changed. The double jeopardy law has been changed in Queensland, but you could never be tried again if you were found not guilty. But if that charge had failed and they were found not guilty for some technical reason,
there's 14 others.
There's 14 others technically that could be charged. It's something that I certainly support with multiple charges or murders like that. It gives them that opportunity to proceed further, especially if people are likely to get out on a technicality.
It was, it was a very good idea from the police's perspective. Only a few days into their trial began later in 1973, and only a few days into the trial, Stewart began to swallow even more wire. Every time they were taken to court within the walls of Bogorow Jail, the two men continued to protest their innocence, physically injuring, maiming themselves, drinking chemicals. Stewart was renowned for physically sewing his lips together with wire or anything he'd get his hands on, so that police couldn't verbal him again, put words into his mouth. But he would drink bleach, chemicals that he'd managed to get access to. And Stewart was renowned amongst prison officers for his ability to no matter how well they searched him, he would somehow manage to get items that he could mutilate and injure himself with. And on one occasion, on several occasions, he made wire crosses out of pieces of that tensioned metal sort of that you find in a bed spring in his cell. He fashioned them into a cross by putting rubber band around the points, put the two pieces of metal, get them to overlap, and then bring the corners together and then secure a rubber band around the hole. They put in a piece of fruit or something that he was allowed to have as a ration and swallow it. And then when it went into his stomach, the stomach acids would dissolve the rubber band and the metal would fling apart and tear his stomach to ribbons. And of course, then he'd have to be taken to hospital for treatment. I've often wondered, not a lot is ever said about this, Paul, but Stewart in 1962, 61 years ago, he actually escaped from the mental health unit of the Royal Brisbane Hospital and went on the run and was cornered at the Regent Cinema in Brisbane just as a youth. He was serving time for, I think it was unlawful use of a motor vehicle, but it feigned having mental illness, and so was taken to hospital for treatment. He was taken from Bogorow to treatment at the hospital, and he managed to escape. And I often wondered if part of the reason he did this act, there was no hospital at the jail that could treat him for a serious thing like having his stomach torn apart. I often wondered if his aim was to get out of the jail so perhaps he could try and effect an escape again.
Well, you'd think that that's possible, because it's pretty crazy stuff to do, to injure yourself. And he missed a lot of the trial because he was, ill and the judge realised it was being done deliberately, that the case wasn't going to be held up. But either he was mad and or very, very cunning.
His mother called him her loving maniac. That was her nickname for her son, her loving maniac. John had been in and out of prison all through his youth, stealing cars, petty robbery. I met a taxi driver a few years ago who'd been ripped off by him. He was notorious. He'd phone a taxi to the north side. His family lived on the north side of Brisbane. Yeah. His father died when he was quite young, so he often sort of carried on, made it hell for his mother, who stood by him though all the time. He had a brother, Danny, as well, who ultimately was to play a role in his arrest. Danny gave evidence to police that he provided John with petrol drum, so not knowing that it was going to be used for the fire. But Stewart notoriously, when he was a youth in jail, was always trying to escape. He was a prolific writer of poetry. Officers found him quite a nice guy. Like, if he liked you, he liked you. If he hated you, he hated you. He always knew where you stood with John Andrew Stewart, by all accounts. But yeah, as you said, during his trial, he sacked his defence counsel. He was unrepresented at the time he was actually sentenced. He was lying in a hospital bed. First time, I think, in Queensland history that someone had been sentenced to.
I think that might be Australian history. Sentenced to a life imprisonment, and what wasn't in the court to hear the sentence being handed down. Yeah. So as I say, it was either really crazy or really crafty.
Well, it was on the 11th of October 1973 that the jury returned the verdict that had been predicted. They were guilty of murder, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labour. The trial had lasted 31 days. Over 150 witnesses had been called. Only Finch was present to hear the words of the justice, and he just sighed in disbelief. Stewart was told the jury's verdict 30 minutes later by a senior prison official as he lay in a hospital bed. In our next episode, Paul, I'm going to be talking with John Peel, who's a former prison officer at Bogorow, and he was responsible for overseeing Stewart and Finch, their security, in what was called C Wing Brisbane Prison, aka Moggo Road Jail. And John's going to share his insights with us about what they were like as individuals. But like we've already alluded to it in this episode, the question of whether or not they actually did what they did. And under parliamentary privilege in 2015, a well-known former criminal made the claim that he'd actually been the one that had set fire to the Torino's nightclub in the Valley. And he claimed that he'd been ordered to do that by two men whose names are now infamous in Queensland and have long been characters, dark, shadowy figures in the background of our city and our state. And that's Vince O'Dempsey and Gary Dubai.
Mm-hmm.
These men, I own a 1930 Studebaker in the Studebaker Club. I'm a member of the Studebaker Club, and these blokes fancy themselves as kind of modern day outlaws in a way. They drove fast Studebaker cars. They were involved in armed robberies and thievery. In 1980, they were named as being. It was recommended that their names came up at the inquest into the disappearance of Barbara McCulkin and her daughters.
Yes.
Just a year after the Whiskey A Go-Go firebombing, almost to the month, there was early in 1974, Barbara McCulkin and her two young children were abducted from their Highgate Hill, Brisbane home, and for decades it was unknown exactly what had happened to them. But Gary Dubai and Vince O'Dempsey were named as being, by neighbours, as being seen leaving the property around the time that the women disappeared. Charges were recommended to be laid, but never were. And in more recent times, though, their names have come up again in relation to this era of Brisbane and the disappearance of prostitutes and individuals. It's quite extraordinary that the suggestion these days is that they were behind, the organisers behind the Whiskey A Go-Go. Do you enjoy reading about true crime? The Murder Trails series explores some of Queensland's most infamous cases, including Who Killed Betty Shanks, Slim Halliday, the taxi driver killer, The Rampage of Killer Cast, and Innocence Lost, the last man hanged in Queensland. Just some of the titles available at jacksim.com.au. I'm Jack Sim. Please support my local publishing business as I explore some of Queensland's dark past. Shall I tell you what I reckon, Paul?
Please do.
I think that John Andrew Stewart and James Richard Finch were definitely involved. I think the man who drove the car was Billy McCulkin. I think he drove the vehicle, well-known tattoo parlour operator. I think he was the one that drove the vehicle. That's my feeling, just from people I know, I've spoken to. I think O'Dempsey and Dubai were behind organising it. And I think John Andrew Stewart was feeding his friend Brian Bolton and other journalists and police a fictional story that southern criminals were going to stand over local operators. I think this was a local plan. I don't think there was a southern element to it at all, just like that detective said.
I think that bit's definitely right, that it was local. But those other two who weren't charged originally with the McCulkin murders, I think that was right, because the Crown decided that there was not enough evidence at the time, but they ultimately
they were found guilty. Gary Dubai has died in jail, and Vince O'Dempsey is currently serving life in relation to the abduction of the McCulkins. The story behind that we'll explore in another episode in more detail, Paul, but essentially Barbara was aware her husband had driven the vehicle or played a role in the Whiskey A Go-Go, and told friends and family and neighbours that her husband, if he didn't better treat her, she would go to the police. And so O'Dempsey and Dubai, in my view, there's no doubt, then stepped in to silence her. What became of them is unknown. Their bodies have never been found. But Dubai and O'Dempsey were given life imprisonment in the not too distant past.
That's right.
For their abduction and murder.
I think you're right that even though only two people were found guilty or even charged in relation to the Whiskey A Go-Go murders, possibly another three could have been roped in at the time. But the evidentiary issues were very difficult in those days. DNA evidence was not on the horizon, and the pair who were found guilty, I agree with you, I think they were guilty. What their direct involvement was, we may never know, and I certainly await the outcome of the coroner's inquest from the last year.
At the time of our podcast going to air, the Queensland government has initiated a wonderful thing, a long time in coming, but the current government took the initiative and opened an inquest in relation to the Whisky A Go-Go, which was called for by relatives and friends 50 years ago at the time of the inquiry. People were so palpably concerned that the truth might not be able to be found unless something as with the legal abilities of the Royal Commission. People were calling for it way back then. Half a century down the track, we're keenly awaiting the outcome of that inquest, which we brought down this year, in a last attempt to kind of get to the truth. One thing I often, just one last point, Paul, it quite often comes up. I get people say to me or contact me when I go to book signings or on tours, and they say, but I don't think Stewart and Finch were involved. They believe the story that these men were innocent. Look, one thing that's sort of been forgotten time is that James Finch confessed to his role in the crime. Front page story of the Sun newspaper that Brian Bolton had once been a journalist of, on Halloween, 31st of October 1988, just shortly after Finch had been released on parole and he returned to England. The day after, he made a live via satellite confession on national television to Yana Wendt, the wonderful current affairs journalist of the day. He confessed to the Sun newspaper, to again another wonderful great journalist of the day, Dennis Watt.
Yes. And
he made a full confession to him with all the details of his involvement and John Andrew Stewart's involvement in the Whisky A Go-Go. Tom Hamilton, the welterweight boxer who was murdered in 1975, named him as being with Finch, named that he was the one with him that rolled the drums into the club. He named Billy McCulkin as being the man driving the getaway car. It was a complicated scenario that Finch laid out, but there's no doubt of those two men's involvement. It just didn't sweep up a number of others.
I loved the headline at the time. I did.
I did it.
Unless you really did it, why would you admit to doing that? And I think that's sort of proof positive of his involvement in that. We may never know the full truth, but I agree that we certainly know that Stewart and Finch were involved in those 15 horrific murders in 1973.
I was just thinking, Paul, I think earlier on in our podcast, I think I said that Billy McCulkin was a tattooist. It was Billy Stokes who was the tattooist.
He was definitely a local tattooist up, I think, on Petrie Terrace.
Yeah, I think Billy McCulkin, I think he ran like a pawnbroker's business, I think, or something of that nature. It's really, all these names, it's hard to imagine a more poorly laid out conspiracy with all these characters involved. Like, of course, there's also the overtone of, whether the police are involved. This is the era of, individuals in the licensing branch who were very bad men, and there's some suggestion that perhaps, they were involved in some way that they might get a cut of the insurance money when these clubs burned, or, that's always been the suggestion that perhaps all of this was also tied up with attempts to gain insurance money, or God knows what. It's such a mess. After 50 years, you can only hope that the current inquest might lay bare a bit more clearly exactly who was involved. And I'd like to think that maybe, even at this late stage, perhaps charges might be laid against a certain individual for his role, I think, as the mastermind of it all, but we'll just have to wait and see.
I think what we do know is that even after 50 years, the web of criminals who had a history of criminality, that's pretty well known. How it all connected, we may never know, but let's hope that inquest will put to bed 50 years of uncertainty.
Paul, thank you so much for sharing these episodes with me. Are you happy to come back again and do another couple at some point?
What do we call it?
I nicknamed it the Skull Cave.
The Skull Cave, yeah. And I'm glad that you've moved from the books that you've been producing for many decades now, into modern technology.
Yeah, that's right. Again, podcasting. Thanks, mate. I appreciate it. And of course, our passion for Australian history will be reflected in some more cases we'll take on board. And listeners and viewers, wonderful to have you along on this journey of Murder Trails, official podcast of Crime Tours Australia. I look forward to taking you on a journey to learn about some other infamous homicides and criminal cases in our next episode. I'm Jack Sim. Make sure to join us next time. Discover Brisbane's criminal history. Join me, Jack Sim, and my team of guides as we explore Queensland's fascinating criminal past. Cases we explore include the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Betty Shanks murder, and the Vampire Killer. We have a range of different crime walks and coach tours. To book a tour, brisbanecrimetours.com.au or crimetoursaustralia.com.au. Look forward to sharing our dark past with you.